Welcome to Lore of the Rings, where we wander the forgotten halls of Middle-earth and unearth the stories Tolkien left in shadow. Before we begin, take a moment to share in the comments where you are listening from, and whether this tale has found you in the quiet of dawn or the deep hours of night. There are names spoken in the halls of Rivendell that echo with reverence. Gandalf the Grey, who became white. Saruman the Wise, who fell into ruin. Radagast the Brown, friend to bird and beast. These are the wizards the West remembers. Their deeds are woven into song, their faces carved into memory. Children in the Shire grew up hearing tales of the Grey Pilgrim who saved the world. Scholars in Gondor study the treachery of Saruman as a lesson in the corruption of power. Even Radagast, strange and reclusive though he was, left his mark. The birds still sing songs he taught them, and the forests remember his passing. But there were 5 who came across the sea. 5 emissaries of the Valar, cloaked in mortal form, sent to challenge the rising shadow of Sauron, and 2 of them vanished. No monuments stand for them in Gondor. No elves sing their names beneath the stars of Rivendell. No dwarves carve their likenesses into stone. They passed into the east, beyond the mountains of shadow, beyond the sea of Ran, into lands where even the maps of the wise grow blank and uncertain. Their names were Alatar and Pallando, the Ithrin Luin, the Blue Wizards, and their fate remains one of the great mysteries of the ages. Some say they failed, that they were seduced by the very darkness they were sent to oppose, that they became sorcerers and tyrants in lands of sand and shadow. Others whisper that they succeeded beyond all measure, turning the tide of history in ways the West will never comprehend, breaking Sauron's hold on peoples and places that would otherwise have drowned the free peoples in an unstoppable tide. Perhaps they became dark lords ruling from obsidian thrones. Perhaps they became martyrs whose names were lost to time. Or perhaps they became something else entirely, something neither light nor shadow, but a third path known only to those who walk the farthest edges of the world. Imagine, if you will, the moment they departed. Not with the fanfare that accompanied Gandalf, not with the pride that radiated from Saruman. No, they left quietly. 2 robed figures walking toward the sunrise, their staffs casting long shadows behind them. The elves watched them go with troubled eyes. Círdan the shipwright, who had lived since before the sun first rose, who saw deeper and further than almost any being in Middle-earth, watched them depart from the Grey Havens, and even he could not rid what fate awaited them. Galadriel, whose sight pierced many veils, looked eastward as they vanished beyond the horizon, and her expression was troubled. For where they journeyed, the sight of the Valar grew dim. Where they walked, the music of creation turned to whispers, and then to silence. The West remembers its heroes. It erects statues in marble and granite, composes epics that last for ages, lights candles in halls of memory. The names of the great are passed from parent to child, from teacher to student, from age to age, never forgotten. But what of those who walk into darkness and never return? What of those whose victories are written in languages the West has forgotten, whose sacrifices are known only to the stones and winds of distant deserts? What of those who give everything and are remembered by no one? The story of the Blue Wizards is not a tale of glory. It is a tale of absence, of silence, of a mystery so profound that even Tolkien himself, the great chronicler, the master of his own mythology, could not settle on a single truth. He wrote of them in fragments, in letters penned late at night, in notes scrawled in the margins of his great histories. In some versions, they failed utterly, corrupted by the very power they wielded. In others, they triumphed beyond all hope, saving Middle-earth in ways no song would ever celebrate. And in the final reckoning, in the last years of his life, he left them suspended between fates. Two figures lost in the mists of his own imagination, neither vindicated nor condemned, simply absent. But let us follow them, you and I. Let us journey past the black gate of Mordor, beyond the dead marshes and the ash-choked plains, past the eastern borders, where even the rangers of Ithilien fear to tread. Let us walk into the vast and terrible lands where Sauron's influence spread like poison in water, where his servants worked for millennia to corrupt and enslave. Let us go where the records are silent and the legends grow strange, where the familiar certainties of the West dissolve into questions without answers. For though the West may have forgotten them, the East remembers, in firelight stories told by nomadic tribes who camp beneath unfamiliar stars, in ruins that predate even Ned Mena's fall, where strange symbols are carved into stone that no scholar can decipher, in whispered warnings passed from grandfather to grandson across generations. Beware the sorcerers in blue, for they walk where the gods do not. They see what should not be seen. They know what should not be known. Were they heroes who saved Middle-earth in the shadows, invisible and unsung? Or were they traitors who betrayed their sacred mission and became the very darkness they were sent to fight? The answer, like the wizards themselves, may be lost forever in the deserts of the East, buried beneath centuries of sand and silence. For beyond the mountains, even the Valar's sight grew dim, and the blue wizards walked alone. In the undying lands, where time flows differently, and the stars sing their ancient songs, the Valar held council. It was a rare gathering, for the powers of Arda seldom convened in full. Marnog, Lord of Winds and Eagles, who sees furthest of all. Varda, Queen of the Stars, whose light Morgoth could never touch. Omo, Lord of all waters, whose voice speaks in every stream. Ald the Smith, maker of mountains. Yavanna, giver of fruits. And among them, Orom the Hunter, the rider of Nahar, who alone of the Valar had hunted Morgoth's creatures through the dark forests of Middle-earth in the elder days. The third age of Middle-earth had begun, but the shadow of Sauron had not ended with the fall of his master, Morgoth. The Dark Lord, diminished but unbroken, was stirring once more. In the depths of Dol Guldur, in the forgotten fortresses of the East, in the southern deserts where ancient evils still slumbered, his will was spreading like roots beneath dead soil, and the free peoples of Middle-earth, elves, dwarves, and men, were fractured, weakened, unprepared. The great elven kingdoms were fading. The line of kings in Gondor would soon fail. The dwarves delved too deep and woke ancient horrors, and men, ever susceptible to the lies of the enemy, were divided into countless kingdoms that warred among themselves as often as they fought the darkness. The Valar, bound by the laws set down after Morgoth's defeat, could not intervene directly. The days of gods walking openly in Middle-earth, of Valar making war with their full might, had passed. The world had been broken once by such power, reshaped and sundered. It could not withstand such forces again. But neither could the Valar abandon the children of Iluvatar to face such darkness alone. The elves, the firstborn, were their beloved, and men, the secondborn, were Ilúvatar's own mystery, the younger children whose fate even the Valar could not fully perceive. And so they conceived a plan, subtle, measured, and terribly dangerous. They would send emissaries, not as gods, but as guides, not as warriors with flaming swords, but as counselors with wisdom and patience, not to conquer Sauron with overwhelming divine might, but to inspire the peoples of Middle-earth to resist him themselves, to kindle in their hearts the courage and wisdom they would need to stand against the darkness. These emissaries were the Maiar, spirits of the same order as Sauron himself, though vastly different in purpose and temperament. They were lesser angels, servants of the Valar, each with their own gifts and inclinations. But to be sent to Middle-earth, they would have to be diminished. They would be clothed in the flesh of old men, vulnerable to pain, weariness, and even death. Their memories of Valinor would be dimmed, their vast power restrained and channeled through mortal forms. They would know hunger. They would know doubt. They would know the terrible weight of a mission that could take centuries to fulfill, or end in utter failure. 5 were chosen. Curumo, who would be called Saruman, greatest in lore and craft, master of ringcraft and the workings of power. Olrin, who would become Gandalf, wisest in empathy and hope, who alone among the Maiar had walked among the elves in the elder days as a friend and teacher. Awendil, later known as Radagast, lover of the wild and growing things, friend to bird and beast and tree. These 3 were sent first, arriving in the west where their influence would be felt most keenly among the kingdoms of elves and men. But there were 2 others. Alatar the Blue. His true name in Valinor is lost even to the records of the wise, but he was chosen by Aurum the Hunter himself, the Valar who once rode through Middle-earth in the elder days, pursuing the servants of Morgoth to the ends of the earth, hunting down the corrupted creatures that plagued the awakening elves. If Aurum selected him, it was for a reason. Alatar was not meant to dwell among the elves and council kings in marble halls. He was not meant to be a diplomat or a scholar. He was meant for darker work, for pursuit, for endurance, for the hunt that never ends. He was chosen to go where light was scarce and the enemy's power ran deep. And with Alatar came Pallando, whose name means far-sighted, or far wanderer. Whether he volunteered or was commanded is unclear. The texts contradict themselves. Some writings suggest he went at the request of Alatar, bound by friendship or ancient oath, unwilling to let his companion journey into darkness alone. Others hint he was chosen specifically for his vision. A Maiar who could perceive not just what was, but what might be. A seer of roads not yet taken, of futures hanging in the balance. Perhaps both are true. Perhaps Pallando's gift was to see the many paths ahead, and in that seeing, he understood that Alatar would need a companion, that some roads are too dark to walk alone. Together, they were given a singular and terrible task: travel east. Not to the comfortable kingdoms of Gondor, where white towers gleamed in the sun. Not to the green fields of Rohan, where horses ran free. Not to the havens of the elves, where memory of Valinor still lingered in song. Not to the mountain halls of the dwarves, where ancient crafts were still practiced. No, they were to venture into the lands Sauron had corrupted longest and deepest. Ron, Khand, Harad, the vast, unconquered territories where the Dark Lord's cults ran deepest, where the memory of Morgoth's tyranny still burned in the blood of enslaved peoples, where darkness was not an invading force, but the air itself. Their mission was not to fight Sauron directly, for such was forbidden to the Istari. They could not match his power with power. They could not raise armies and march on Barad-dûr. Instead, they were to sow doubt among his followers, to weaken his armies before they could march west, to ignite rebellion in the hearts of those who served him, to kindle hope in places where hope had been extinguished for generations, to work in secret, in shadow, never revealing their true nature, never claiming authority, simply being there, teaching, guiding, planting seeds that might not bloom for centuries. It was a mission that would take not years, but ages. It was a mission without glory, without witness, without hope of return or recognition. It was a mission designed for those willing to be forgotten. And so, in an age before even the rings of power were forged, before Sauron took his fair form and deceived the elven smiths, Alatar and Pallando departed. They did not sail to the Grey Havens as the others eventually did. They went south and east, around the coasts, through lands where even the elves had never set foot. They walked through jungles where the trees grew, so thick the sun never touched the ground. They crossed deserts where the sand burned like coals and the air shimmered with heat. They passed serpent, temples and blood, stained altars, the remnants of Morgoth's ancient corruption, into the heart of a world that had been poisoned, long before Sauron ever set foot in Mordor. The records say little of their early journeys. Did they travel together, or did they part ways, each taking a separate road into the vast darkness of the east? Did they disguise themselves as merchants, as wandering hermits, as beggars or princes? Did they gather followers, founding secret orders of those who would resist the enemy? Or did they walk alone, speaking their truths to whoever would listen, planting seeds without ever seeing them grow? We do not know. What we do know is that they passed beyond the reach of elven messengers, beyond the watch of the great eagles, beyond even the dreams and visions of the wise, and in time they became legend. Not the bright legends sung in Gondor, but the strange and troubling myths whispered in the shadows of the east. Stories of wanderers who spoke the old tongues, languages not heard since the First Age, of sorcerers who broke the chains of tyrants, or forged new ones, of blue, robed figures glimpsed at the edges of firelight, watching, waiting, judging, of teachers who came and went like the wind, leaving behind words that burned in the heart long after they had departed. But when they passed beyond Mordor's black sands, no message from them ever returned. To speak of the East is to speak of absence. The chronicles of Gondor mention it only in passing, usually in contexts of war. The Wainriders who invaded, the Easterlings who served Morgoth and later Sauron, the endless waves of enemies that came from those distant lands. The maps of the elves leave it unnamed, blank spaces on parchment marked only with warnings. Here there be dragons. Here the shadow falls thick. Here we do not go. It is a blank space on the edge of the known world. A place defined not by what it is, but by what it is not. It is not the Shire with its green hills and comfortable holes. It is not Rivendell with its waterfalls and ancient wisdom. It is not Lothlorien, where time itself moves differently. It is not the safe, familiar West, where the light of the Elder still lingers, where the memory of Valinor has not entirely faded. But absence does not mean emptiness. The East is ancient, older, perhaps, than even the kingdoms of Nentmenor at their height. Older than Gondor and Arna. Older than the first alliance of elves and men. It is a land of burning horizons and endless plains, of cracked riverbeds where water has not flowed in living memory, of dunes that shift like the tides of the sea, swallowing entire cities, and then revealing them centuries later, their bones picked clean by wind and time. In the far reaches of Ran, where the great inland sea shimmers beneath a merciless sun, there are ruins that predate the First Age, temples to gods whose names were forgotten when Morgoth fell, whose faces were deliberately erased from every stone, because to look upon them was to invite madness. In the deserts of Khand, travelers speak of black ziggurats half, buried in sand, inscribed with curses in tongues no living scholar can read, where even the bravest dare not camp for the night, lest they dream dreams that drive them mad. And in the jungles of Harad, where the trees grow so thick that daylight never touches the ground, there are altars still stained with the blood of sacrifices made to powers older than Sauron. Older perhaps than even the Valar themselves. Remnants of the discord that entered the music of creation at the very beginning. This is the world the blue wizards entered. Imagine them, two robed figures walking side by side through a land that does not welcome them. The sun is brutal, beating down without mercy, turning the sand into a furnace. The wind carries no comfort, only grit that stings the eyes and fills the mouth. There are no roads here, no inns, no friendly villages where a traveler might find rest. There is only the endless march through dust and stone, through heat that warps the air and makes the horizon shimmer with false promises of water, through nights so cold the stars themselves seem to freeze and the breath turns to ice. They do not speak the languages of this place, not at first. They must learn painstakingly, tongue by tongue, dialect by dialect, the words of peoples who have lived in isolation for millennia. They do not know the customs. They do not understand the intricate webs of honor and shame, of blood, debt and tribal loyalty that govern life in these harsh lands. They are strangers in a land that has learned to hate strangers, where outsiders are either killed on sight or enslaved, where trust is a luxury no one can afford. But they were not sent to be welcomed. They were sent to endure. The peoples of the East are not evil by nature. This is a truth the West often forgets, blinded by centuries of war and the simple narratives that war requires. They are men, descended from the same stock as the Edain, the ancestors of Nentmenor, the fathers of Elendil and Isildur. In the First Age, when the elves first awoke by the waters of Cuvain, some of the race of men journeyed west and befriended them. They learned the elven tongues, fought beside the Elder in their wars, were guided toward the light and taught wisdom and craft. These were the Edain, and they were rewarded with the island of Nentmenor, with long life and prosperity. But not all men went west. Some remained in the darkness of the East. Some were too afraid. Some were too proud. Some simply did not know the way. and those who stayed were left behind, left to fend for themselves in lands ravaged by Morgoth's wars, where his servants still prowled. Left to be prey for his orcs, his werewolves, his dragons. Left to watch as the Valar and the elves turned their eyes westward and forgot them. And into that abandonment, into that fertile ground of resentment and fear, Morgoth planted seeds of darkness. His lieutenants, Sauron chief among them, whispered to the tribes of the east. They did not come as conquerors, not at first. They came as teachers. They promised power to the powerless. They promised strength to those who had been preyed upon. They taught cruelty as survival, domination as virtue, sacrifice as piety. They took the natural strength of those peoples, their endurance, their pride, their fierce loyalty to kin and tribe, and twisted it into chains. They taught them that the world was a place of eternal struggle, that only the strong deserved to survive, that mercy was weakness and compassion was folly. Over centuries, over millennia, the Easterlings became not allies of the free peoples, but instruments of the enemy. Their warriors marched under the banners of Morgoth in the First Age, and later, of Sauron in the Second and Third. Their priests worshipped shadows and demons, offering blood to appease dark powers. Their kings bowed to the Dark Lord, not because they were inherently wicked, but because they knew no other way. Because for generation after generation, their stories had taught them that this was simply how the world worked, that the strong ruled and the weak served, that the gods, if gods there were, cared nothing for justice or kindness, only for power. This was the darkness Alatar and Pallando were sent to break. But how does one break a curse that has lasted for millennia? How does one walk into a culture built on blood and domination, where every institution, every tradition, every song and story reinforces the enemy's lies, and say, there is another way? How does one convince a warlord, raised to believe that strength is the only virtue, that mercy is not weakness? How does one kindle hope in a people who have been told, generation after generation, that the gods hate them, that they are cursed, that darkness is their only inheritance? Some legends say the blue wizards began small, that they moved among the common folk, the farmers scratching out life in the marginal lands, the herders watching their flocks in the wilderness, the forgotten slaves laboring in the fields and mines, that they taught in secret, using not grand speeches or displays of power, but small acts of kindness, healing a wound when no healer would come, blessing a well so the water ran pure, speaking truth in places where only lies had been heard for so long that people had forgotten truth existed. They did not arrive as conquerors riding at the head of armies. They arrived as beggars, as wanderers, as apparent fools, old men in worn robes who asked for nothing and gave freely of what little they had. And slowly, imperceptibly, like water wearing away stone, things began to change. In one version of the tale, they founded hidden enclaves, sanctuaries where the teachings of the Valar were preserved in defiance of Sauron's agents, schools where the young learned that power need not come from domination, that strength could be found in service, that the strong had a duty to protect the weak rather than exploit them. Temples where prayers were offered not to Morgoth or Sauron, or the 1,000 petty demons of the East, but to the one, Eru-Ilvatar, the source of all creation, who loved all his children equally. These enclaves were fragile, always in danger of discovery, always one betrayal away from annihilation. But they endured, and in enduring, they became seeds of resistance, places where a different vision of the world could take root and slowly, secretly, begin to grow. In another version, darker and more troubling, the blue wizards did not resist the culture they found. They adapted to it. They recognized that to be heard in the East, they would need to speak its language, not just linguistically, but culturally. They took on the trappings of warlords themselves, raising armies, wielding sorcery openly, ruling from thrones of stone and iron. Some say they did this as a strategy, that to fight the darkness, they had to speak its language, to gain the trust and respect of peoples who understood only power. That they became, in effect, benevolent tyrants, using the very structures of domination they despised in order to slowly transform them from within. Others say they were corrupted, that the weight of their mission crushed them over the centuries, and they became the very thing they were sent to destroy. Sorcerer, kings ruling through fear and manipulation, indistinguishable from the servants of Sauron they had come to oppose. And perhaps both are true. Perhaps Alatar walked one path, and Pallando another. Perhaps one remained true to the mission, while the other fell into darkness. Perhaps they even became enemies, fighting a hidden war in the deserts of the East, each convinced the other had betrayed everything they once stood for. Or perhaps the line between light and shadow in those distant lands is not so clear as it is in the comfortable West, where good and evil wear easily recognizable faces. For in the East, morality is not written in black and white. It is written in shades of dust and blood, in survival and sacrifice, in impossible choices where every option leads to suffering. The wizards who walked there could not afford the luxury of purity. They had to make choices, terrible choices, that no song would ever celebrate, that no history would ever justify. They had to decide, again and again, how much of themselves they could compromise without losing themselves entirely. And perhaps, in the end, they could not answer that question. Did they win? Did they lose? The West will never know. But there are signs, subtle signs, easy to miss if you are not looking for them. In the War of the Ring, when Sauron's full might turned westward, the armies of the East and South were vast, but they were not endless. Had every tribe, every kingdom, every cultist and warlord sworn to the dark, Lord marched under his banner, the free peoples would have been annihilated in days. The armies at the Pelennor fields and the Black Gate would have been a mere vanguard, the first wave of millions. But they did not come. Whole nations stayed home. Entire warlords refused the call. And in the aftermath, when Sauron fell and his power shattered, many of those same peoples turned away from darkness without need of conquest, without forced conversion. They simply stopped, as if some spell had been broken, as if seeds planted long ago had finally bloomed. Was that the work of the Blue Wizards? Had they, in the unseen depths of history, broken the chains that might have doomed Middle-earth? Had they planted doubts in the minds of kings, stirred rebellions among the enslaved, preserved sanctuaries of light in the very heart of darkness? Or had they forged new chains, ones the West would never see? Had they built empires of their own, ruling through manipulation and sorcery, becoming not liberators but new tyrants whose influence would linger for ages to come? In the east, light and shadow are twins, and none could tell which the blue wizards served. To study the blue wizards is to enter a labyrinth with no exit. Every path forks. Every answer spawns 3 new questions. Every piece of evidence contradicts another. And at the center of it all stands the professor himself, J.R.R. Tolkien, who could not, or perhaps would not, settle on a single truth, who rewrote their story again and again, never satisfied, never certain, leaving behind a tangle of contradictory accounts that scholars still debate to this day. In his earliest writings, the blue wizards failed. Not just failed, they betrayed their mission entirely. In notes written during the composition of The Lord of the Rings, and shortly after, Tolkien described them as having fallen into darkness, much as Saruman did, but far earlier and in far more subtle ways. They went into the East with good intentions, with noble purpose, with the blessings of the Valar themselves. But the weight of their task, the isolation, the sheer endurance required to work in lands where no help would ever come, where no message could be sent, where they were utterly and completely alone, it broke them. And so they became sorcerers, dark lords in their own right. They established cults of power, teaching forbidden knowledge to the Easterlings, binding them with spells and oaths that corrupted as deeply as anything Sauron might have devised. They raised towers of dark stone and ruled from thrones of iron. They commanded armies and demanded worship. They may not have served Sauron directly, may even have opposed him as rivals rather than servants. But they served their own ambitions, their own hunger for power and control. They became the very tyrants they were meant to overthrow. And by the time of the War of the Ring, they were either dead, their kingdoms turned to dust and ruin, or they were lost in madness, hollow shells of what they once were, ruling over forgotten peoples in lands the West would never reach. This version is bleak, profoundly tragic. It suggests that even the emissaries of the Valar are not immune to corruption. That power, no matter how noble its origin, no matter how pure its initial purpose, can rot the soul if wielded too long in darkness. It is the story of missionaries who became conquerors, of liberators who became enslavers, of those who gazed into the abyss and did not merely blink. They dove in, thinking they could master it, only to discover too late that the abyss had mastered them. It is also a warning, a reminder that the road to hell is paved not just with good intentions, but with isolation, with the slow erosion of purpose, with the terrible weight of responsibility borne alone for too long. Gandalf had the friendship of Elrond, the counsel of Galadriel, the loyalty of the hobbits. Saruman, for all his pride, had the White Council. Even Radagast had his birds and beasts. But the blue wizards, they had only each other. And if one fell, or if they turned on each other, there was no one to pull them back. But it is not the only story. In his later years, Tolkien reconsidered. Perhaps he felt the earlier version was too dark, too hopeless. Perhaps it troubled him that the Valar's plan could fail so utterly. Or perhaps, as he aged and his understanding of his own mythology deepened, he saw other possibilities. In writings from the 1950s and 60s, particularly in his unfinished notes and letters, especially a letter to a fan who asked about the blue wizards, a different picture emerges. In this version, the blue wizards succeeded. Not in the way Gandalf succeeded, through visible heroism, through rallying armies and breaking sieges, through dramatic confrontations at the cracks of doom. No, they succeeded quietly, invisibly, in ways that history would never record, but which were no less crucial for being unseen. Tolkien wrote that their mission was to stir up revolt among the peoples under Sauron's dominion, to undermine his influence, to ensure that when the Dark Lord finally moved against the West, his rear guard would be in chaos, his alliances fragile, his armies diminished, and it worked. Imagine the millions who might have marched under Sauron's banner but did not. Imagine the cults that were dismantled, the warlords who were assassinated or convinced to turn from darkness. Imagine the children who were taught in secret to resist the lies of the enemy, who grew up to be leaders of their people, guiding them away from Sauron's service. Imagine entire generations who heard whispers of another way, a better way, planted by two wandering figures who appeared and disappeared like ghosts. By this reading, the Blue Wizards are the unsung heroes of Middle-earth. They saved the West without the West ever knowing. They worked miracles in the shadows, preventing catastrophes that would have made the War of the Ring unwinnable. And when the war was won and the ring destroyed, they did not return to claim glory. They remained in the East, continuing their work, tending the seeds they had planted, healing wounds that would take centuries to close, ensuring that the peoples of those distant lands would not fall back into darkness. Now that Sauron's direct influence was gone, it is a beautiful theory. Hopeful? Just. It restores balance to the story and suggests that the Valar's plan was not folly, but genius. That the Istari's mission, for all its apparent failures, Saruman's betrayal, Radagast's distraction, ultimately succeeded in ways visible and invisible. That the victory at Mount Doom was possible only because of unseen victories, won in distant lands by wizards whose names would never be sung, but Tolkien never confirmed it. He left it as possibility, not canon, as hope, not certainty. And then there is the third path, the one he never fully wrote, but which haunts the margins of the text like a spectre. What if the Blue Wizards became neither villains nor heroes, but something else entirely? What if they transcended the mission they were given? What if, in the depths of the East, they discovered truths the Valar themselves had forgotten or chose to ignore? Consider this: the Istari were sent with limited power, limited memory, limited authority. They were meant to be guides, counselors, inspirers, but not rulers, not commanders, not masters. Their purpose was to help the free peoples resist Sauron. But the ultimate struggle was meant to be waged by elves and men themselves. The Istari were not to dominate, not to use their full power to simply sweep Sauron away. But Alatar and Pallando went further than any of the others. They walked in lands where the influence of the Valar had never reached, or had been twisted beyond recognition. They encountered magics and philosophies that predated even the Ainulindal. Remnants of the Discord Melka, introduced into the music of creation at the very beginning. They spoke with peoples who had their own gods, their own truths, their own songs of creation that bore no resemblance to the stories told in Valinor. What if, in learning from the East, they changed? What if they realized that the binary of Valar versus Morgoth, light versus shadow, west versus east, was itself a lie, or at least an incomplete picture? What if they began to see that the Valar, for all their wisdom and power, represented only one perspective on existence: that there were other ways, other truths, other paths that the powers of Arda had either forgotten or deliberately suppressed. This is the forbidden theory, the dangerous one, the one that destabilizes the entire moral framework of Middle-earth. It suggests that there are more players in the game than Tolkien's Western-centric narrative allows. That the Valar, while good and wise, are not infallible. That their plan for Middle-earth, for all its beauty, is still a form of control. Benevolent, perhaps, but control nonetheless. That the free peoples are not the only peoples worth saving. Not the only ones with legitimate claims to their own destinies. That history, as written by the victors, is always incomplete, always biased, always obscuring truths that do not fit the narrative. In this reading, the blue wizards are neither saviors nor traitors. They are revolutionaries, apostates. They broke the oath they swore when they crossed the sea from Valinor. They abandoned the mission of the Istari and became something new, agents of a third path. Neither Sauron's domination nor the Valar's guidance, but a messy, difficult, imperfect vision of mortal self-determination. They decided that the peoples of the East deserved to forge their own destinies, free from the interference of either dark lords or benevolent powers from across the sea. And if that is true, then their absence from the War of the Ring was not a tragedy or a failure. It was a statement, a declaration of independence. This is your fight, West, not ours. We have our own. It is a seductive idea in a way. It reframes the blue wizards, not as failures who were corrupted or heroes who succeeded in obscurity, but as rebels who chose their own path. It suggests that they saw something the others did not, that true freedom means rejecting even benevolent masters, that the Valar, for all their love of the children of Iluvatar, still saw them as children to be guided rather than equals to be respected, that the mission of the Istari, for all its noble purpose, was still fundamentally about ensuring that Middle-earth developed according to Valinor's plan, not its own. But it is also deeply uncomfortable, because if the blue wizards turn their backs on the Valar, what does that say about the mission itself? What does it say about the other Istari who remained faithful? What does it say about Gandalf, who sacrificed everything, who died and was sent back, who bore the weight of the West's hope on his shoulders through centuries of struggle? Was he the hero, loyally fulfilling his duty? Or was he the one who never questioned, who never saw beyond the boundaries of the mission he was given? There are no answers to these questions, only echoes, only silence, only the uncomfortable possibility that truth is more complex than any single narrative can contain. But let us return to what we know, or think we know. There is a passage in the appendices to The Lord of the Rings, where Tolkien mentions, almost in passing, that there were cults and secret societies in the East that resisted Sauron. He does not elaborate. He does not name them. But the very fact that he mentions them at all is intriguing. Were these the work of the Blue Wizards? Organizations they founded? Philosophies they taught? Rebellions they inspired? Or were they something darker? Mystery religions built on corrupted interpretations of the wizards' teachings, twisted into something unrecognizable, perhaps even contrary to what Alatar and Pallando intended. And then there are the silences, the things not said. Gandalf, who knows so much, who remembers ages long past, who walks in both the seen and unseen worlds, says almost nothing about the blue wizards. Saruman, in all his pride and jealousy, never mentions them. And surely if they had failed as spectacularly as the earliest versions suggest, he would have used them as examples of the folly of going east. Radagast, who might have known something, is never asked. It is as if the other Istari have agreed, consciously or not, never to speak of the blue wizards, as if their fate is a wound too deep to touch, a mystery too dangerous to explore. Why? Perhaps because they succeeded in ways the West could never accept. Perhaps because they failed in ways too shameful to remember. Or perhaps because the truth is so strange, so far beyond the moral categories of the Third Age, that it cannot be spoken without unraveling other certainties. Two wizards, two destinies, two paths diverging in a dark wood, and no way to know which one they took. Salvation or betrayal. A mystery does not end when its subjects vanish. It echoes through the ages. It leaves traces, faint, often ambiguous, easily missed by those not looking for them. And if you know where to look, in the margins of old maps, in the songs of defeated peoples, in the symbols carved into forgotten ruins, you can still find the blue wizards. Not as men, but as ghosts. Not as history, but as myth. Not as presence, but as the shapes their absence carved into the world. The first echoes are found in the wars themselves. When Sauron's forces marched westward during the late Third Age, they came from many lands. From Raman came the Easterlings, fierce, disciplined warriors clad in bronze and scale armor, riding in chariots and fighting with curved swords. From Harad came the Southrons, with their Oliphants, the Maimakil, great beasts of war that dwarfed even the trolls, and their sun, scorched banners bearing serpents and black suns. From Khand came infantry known for their ruthless efficiency. These were the armies the Free Peoples faced at the Pelennor Fields, at the Black Gate, in the desperate final days of the War of the Ring. But here is the question historians rarely ask. The observation that troubles those who look closely at the numbers: where were the rest? The East is vast, incomprehensibly vast, far larger than all the lands of the West combined. If every tribe, every kingdom, every warlord under Sauron's influence, or within his reach, had answered his call, if every people he had corrupted or enslaved had sent their warriors westward, the armies at the Black Gate would not have numbered in the tens of thousands. They would have numbered in the millions. The West would have been drowned beneath a tide of steel and fire that no alliance of free peoples could have withstood. Gondor would have fallen in days. The Rohirrim would have been swept aside. Even the armies of the elves, diminished as they were, would have been unable to stem the flood, but they did not come. Whole regions stayed silent, entire peoples, known in older ages to worship Morgoth, to serve Sauron, to hate the West with ancient fury, sent no soldiers. Kingdoms that might have raised armies of hundreds of thousands never mobilized. And in the chaos after Sauron's fall, many of those same peoples turned away from darkness without conquest, without forced conversion, without the boot of Gondor on their necks. They simply stopped, as if waking from a dream, as if chains no one knew they were wearing had suddenly broken. Why? The official histories of Gondor offer no answer. They speak vaguely of Sauron's power being incomplete in the east, of his attention being divided, but they do not explain why. They do not account for it. It is simply accepted as fortunate circumstance, as the grace of Ilvatar, as luck. But the whispered histories, the ones passed down in families, told around campfires, preserved in songs and stories that never made it into the official chronicles. They speak of the Ithrinluin, the wanderers in blue, the two who came in the dark times and planted seeds that would not bloom for centuries. The ones who taught that the Dark Lord was not invincible, that rebellion was possible, that the chains could be broken if only one had the courage to try. In some tales, these blue wizards are remembered as saints, miracle workers who healed the sick, who brought rain to parched lands, who spoke with the authority of the ancient world and yet showed compassion to the lowest and most forgotten. In others, they are remembered as demons, sorcerers whose words twisted the mind, who turned brother against brother, who destroyed the old ways and left only chaos in their wake. And in still others, they are remembered as something stranger. Spirits who walked the line between the mortal and divine, who spoke with voices that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, who promised freedom but demanded sacrifice, who taught truths that burned in the heart like fire. There are ruins scattered across the eastern deserts and forgotten valleys, where symbols in blue are still faintly visible on ancient stone. Spirals that draw the eye inward, stars with too many points, stylized eyes that seem to watch whoever looks upon them. No scholar in Minas Tirith can read them. No elf in Rivendell recognizes their origin or purpose. Even the lore masters of Imladris, who preserve knowledge from ages long past, have no record of this script. But they are there, weathered by centuries of wind and sand, half buried but never quite erased, marking places where something happened, where someone taught, where a choice was made that rippled through the ages. And then there are the cults. Not all of them were good. Among the Easterlings, even into the Fourth Age, there were whispers of secret societies that worshipped the blue flame, a force said to grant visions of the future, dominion over lesser wills, and freedom from the tyranny of both dark lords and distant gods. Members of these cults wore indigo robes, carried staffs tipped with sapphire or lapis lazuli, and spoke in riddles and aphorisms that confounded outsiders. They claimed to serve neither Sauron nor the West, neither darkness nor light, but a third power that would outlast them both, a force beyond good and evil, beyond the petty conflicts of the Third Age, rooted in truths older than the world itself. Were these the students of Alatar and Pallando? Organizations they founded, philosophies they taught, the living legacy of their centuries of work? Or were they perversions, good intentions corrupted over generations, twisted by those who came after into something neither of the blue wizards would recognize or approve? There is no way to know. The cults themselves are secretive, refusing to speak to outsiders, and what little is known of them comes from hostile sources. Gondorian scouts, rival tribes, merchants who encountered them and came away disturbed. But the mere existence of such cults suggests that the blue wizard's influence did not vanish when they did. It lingered. It mutated. It took on a life of its own, spreading through the east like roots beneath the soil, invisible but undeniable. Whether that influence was ultimately for good or ill, whether it represented the fulfillment of their mission, or its ultimate perversion, remains one of the great unanswered questions. In one particularly disturbing account, recorded by a Gondorian scout in the early Fourth Age, a group of these cultists were encountered near the ruins of an ancient temple deep in the desert. The scout and his company were searching for rumored caches of weapons left over from Sauron's armies, hoping to secure them before they could fall into the wrong hands. They found the temple at sunset, a crumbling ziggurat half swallowed by sand, its once black stone now worn grey by centuries of wind. Standing before it were 12 figures in blue robes, utterly motionless, facing the setting sun. The scouts' company approached cautiously, hands on weapons, calling out in several languages. The figures did not respond, did not move, did not acknowledge their presence in any way. They simply stood, their faces hidden beneath deep hoods, their hands folded before them, as still as statues. The company waited, growing increasingly uneasy as the sun sank below the horizon and darkness fell. And when they looked back, when they finally summoned the courage to approach closer, the figures were gone, vanished without a trace, without sound, as if they had never been there at all. But carved into the stone where they had stood, in letters that glowed faintly in the moonlight, was a phrase in an archaic dialect of Sindarin that the scout barely recognized. "We wait for the return." Fair return of whom? The Blue Wizards? Sauron? Some other power entirely? The scout never found out, and the temple was swallowed by a sudden sandstorm weeks later, its location lost, never to be found again despite multiple expeditions sent to search for it. Then there are the songs. In the lands of Harad, among the descendants of those who fought at the Pelennor Fields and the Black Gate, there is a ballad that has survived into the Fourth Age. It is not sung openly. The shame of having served the enemy runs deep, but it is preserved by the elders, passed from grandmother to granddaughter, from grandfather to grandson. In quiet moments when the fire burns low and the children are asleep, it tells of two wanderers who came to their ancestors in a time of great suffering, when the Dark Lord's priests demanded blood sacrifices and the sun burned without mercy, when children were taken from their mothers to serve in distant wars. They did not understand. When despair had settled over the land like a shroud, the wanderers did not bring armies to overthrow the priests. They did not bring gold to buy freedom. They did not even bring weapons to arm a rebellion. They brought only words, and the words were these: "You are not slaves. You were never slaves. You only forgot." The song goes on to describe how those words spread, whispered from ear to ear, how they kindled something that had long been dormant. Not hope, exactly, but something deeper. A memory of being human, of having dignity, of deserving more than endless suffering. The song does not claim that the wanderers led a great uprising or changed everything overnight. It simply says that after they came, some people began to remember, and that some of those who remembered found the courage to choose differently when the next call to war came. The song ends with the wanderers departing into the desert at dawn, walking into the rising sun, never to be seen again. But the people who heard them, they began to remember, slowly, quietly, and when the call came to march west and die for Sauron, some did not go, some stayed, some chose their own path. Is this history or myth? Propaganda designed to ease the guilt of having served evil, or genuine memory preserved across generations. The scholars debate, but the song endures, passed down in secret, sung in a minor key that brings tears to those who hear it. And perhaps most haunting of all are the dreams. In the years following the fall of Sauron, several figures across Middle-earth, rangers of the north, wandering wizards, elven lawmasters, reported similar visions. They dreamed of two figures walking through endless blue fire, their faces obscured by light and shadow, their voices speaking in languages no one alive could understand. The dreamers could not tell if the figures were speaking to them, or to each other, or to some unseen audience. They were not calling for help. They were not offering guidance or warning. They were simply there, walking through the flames, watching, waiting, as if the story was not yet over. As if some final chapter had yet to be written. Gandalf, when asked about these dreams by Elrond, grew silent for a long time. Then he said only this: "Some roads are longer than a single age. Some journeys do not end with the breaking of a ring, and some who walk them may never find their way home." What did he mean? Was he saying the blue wizards were still out there, somewhere beyond the reach of maps and memory, continuing their work in the unseen corners of the world? Was he suggesting that their mission had no endpoint, that they were condemned, or perhaps had chosen to wander forever? Or was he warning that their legacy, whatever it truly was, would outlive even the memory of the Third Age, lingering in the world like a shadow that could never quite be dispelled? We do not know. What we do know is that the blue wizards did not fade into nothing. They left marks, scars, questions that have no easy answers. And in the darkest interpretation, the one whispered only in the most secretive councils of the wise. Perhaps they left traps, snares woven so subtly, so patiently, that even the wisest would not see them until it was too late. Seeds that might bloom into something beautiful or something terrible, and no one would know which until the blooming came. Even Gandalf spoke little of them, perhaps because he feared what they became. Close your eyes and imagine it. The War of the Ring is at its height. The armies of the West stand besieged at Minas Tirith, the white city that has endured for thousands of years. The sky is black with smoke and ash. The very air trembles with the thunder of battering rams against the gates. Trolls roar in voices that shake the stones. Orcs swarm like locusts over the Pelennor fields. The Witch King of Angmar, greatest of the Nazgul, descends on wings of shadow, and all hope seems to drain from the hearts of men. The gates are breaking. The walls are crumbling. The end is near. And then, from the east, two figures appear. They are old beyond measure, their robes stained with the dust of 1,000 roads, faded from whatever bright blue they once were to a color somewhere between grey and twilight. Their staffs are worn smooth by centuries of use, the wood dark with age and handling. They do not ride horses. They do not command armies. They are not heralded by trumpets or banners. They simply walk, step by step, through the chaos of the battlefield, and where they walk, something changes. The enemy's forces hesitate, falter, break ranks, as if some spell that held them has suddenly weakened, as if they are seeing something no one else can see. Alatar and Pallando, the blue wizards, returned at last. It is a beautiful thought, isn't it? The lost brothers come home, the missing pieces of the Istari, reunited with Gandalf in the final hour. Imagine the joy, the relief, the astonishment. Imagine Gandalf's face when he sees them. Does he weep? Does he laugh? Does he simply nod once in recognition of a burden shared? Imagine the songs that would be sung of the five who stood together at the end of all things, complete at last. The full council of the Istari arrayed against darkness. But it never happened. The blue wizards did not return for the War of the Ring. They did not ride to the aid of Gondor. They did not stand beside Aragorn at the Black Gate when the captains of the West made their final, desperate gambit. And when the One Ring was destroyed and Sauron's power shattered, when the age ended and a new one began. They did not appear in the celebrations. They did not sail into the West with the other ring-bearers. They did not claim the honor they were due. The recognition, the gratitude of the peoples they had helped to save. They simply remained absent. Why? The simplest answer is that they were dead, that the East had claimed them long ago, that their bones lay buried beneath desert sands or jungle roots, unmarked and unmourned, that their staffs were broken. Their mission ended in failure or obscurity, their names forgotten by all but the most learned of scholars. It is the most straightforward explanation, the one that requires no complex theories or uncomfortable questions. But the simplest answer is not always the truest. Another possibility: they were not needed. Tolkien, in his later writings, suggested that the Blue Wizard's work was already done by the time of the War of the Ring, that their centuries of labor in the East had already weakened Sauron's grip, already ensured that his forces would be divided, his alliances fragile, his rearguard in chaos. In this reading, the Blue Wizards did fight in the War of the Ring, just not on the Pelennor fields. They fought it in Rann and Khand and the far reaches of Harad, in whispered councils and midnight assassinations, in the slow, invisible erosion of the enemy's power that happened far from the sight of the West. And if that is true, then perhaps they did not return because they could not afford to, because their work was not yet finished, because the war in the West was one battle, but the war in the East was eternal, a struggle not for a single decisive victory, but for the gradual transformation of entire cultures, for the healing of wounds that went back millennia, for the planting of seeds that would not bloom for generations. Imagine them, standing on some distant hill, on the morning after Sauron's fall, feeling the shockwave as his power shattered and his tower fell. They do not cheer, they do not weep, they do not raise their staffs in triumph. They simply nod once in acknowledgement and then turn back to the road. Because for every tyrant overthrown, another will rise unless the people themselves change. For every lie exposed, another will be whispered unless the people learn to recognize truth. The work of the Istari is not to win a single war. It is to tend the flame of hope forever in a world that always threatens to go dark. But there is another interpretation, darker, more troubling, more radical in its implications. What if they did not return because they chose not to? What if, after centuries in the East, they no longer saw themselves as servants of the West? What if they looked upon the Valar's plan to guide Middle-earth back into the light, to ensure that the free peoples triumphed and the age ended as the powers had foreseen, and found it lacking? What if they decided that the peoples of the East deserved their own destiny, free from the interference of Valinor, free from the endless cycles of war between light and shadow that the West seemed doomed to repeat. In this version, the Blue Wizards are not heroes who sacrificed everything. They are revolutionaries, defectors, apostates. They broke the oath they swore when they crossed the sea from the undying lands. They abandoned the mission of the Istari and became something new, agents of a third path, neither Sauron's domination nor the Valar's benevolent guidance, but a messy, difficult, imperfect vision of mortal self-determination. And if that is true, then their absence from the War of the Ring was not a tragedy or a failure. It was a declaration. This is your fight, West, not ours. We have our own. It is a seductive idea in a way. It reframes the Blue Wizards not as failures who were corrupted or heroes who succeeded in obscurity, but as rebels who saw beyond the binaries that defined their age. Not as lost, but as free. It suggests that they recognize something the others did not. That the Valar's plan, for all its beauty and wisdom, was still a form of control. That true freedom means rejecting even benevolent masters, that the peoples of Middle-earth, East and West alike, deserved the right to make their own choices, their own mistakes, their own destiny, without divine intervention. But it is also deeply uncomfortable. Because if the Blue Wizards turned their backs on the Valar, what does that say about the mission itself? What does it say about the other Istari, who remained faithful? What does it say about Gandalf, who sacrificed everything, who died and was sent back, who bore the unbearable weight of the West's hope on his shoulders through centuries of struggle and doubt? Was he the hero, loyally fulfilling his duty against impossible odds? Or was he the one who never questioned, who never saw beyond the boundaries of the mission he was given, who remained a servant when he might have chosen to be free? There are no easy answers to these questions, only echoes, only uncomfortable silences. But let us indulge one final vision, one last possibility. Imagine that the Blue Wizards are still out there, not in the East as we know it, but beyond it, in lands so far removed that even the maps of the Fourth Age do not reach them, that even the great explorers and adventurers who will come in later ages will never find, in places where the word, Sauron, is unknown, where the wars of the rings are less than rumors, where new peoples with new stories are rising, facing their own darkness, forging their own light. Imagine them, two ageless wanderers, walking still, not as powerful wizards wielding great magic, but as tired old men who have been walking for so long they have forgotten what it means to rest. Teaching when they can, listening more often than they speak, planting seeds that will not bloom for 1,000 years, tending gardens they will never see in full flower. Imagine them watching the stars in some unnamed wilderness and wondering, distantly, if their brothers ever think of them, if Gandalf, in his rare moments of rest in Valinor, if he ever returned there, gazes eastward and wonders what became of them. If Radagast, wandering his forests, ever whispers their names to the birds and asks if they have seen two figures in blue, and imagine them smiling, just a little, ruefully, and thinking, let him wonder. Let them all wonder. Some stories are better left unfinished. Some questions are more valuable than answers. For those who gaze too long into the East may never find their way back to the light. And so we come, at last, to the question that began this tale. The question that has haunted us through all these words, all these possibilities, all these shadows. The question that has no answer, yet demands one nonetheless. Were the blue wizards heroes or traitors? It is the kind of question mortals love to ask because it promises closure, a verdict, a judgment that allows us to file the story away, to place it in a category, to move on to other mysteries. We want our heroes to be unambiguously heroic, our villains to be clearly villainous. We want stories where the lines are clear, where righteousness is rewarded and evil is punished, where sacrifices are recognized and virtue is celebrated. But the blue wizards, like so much of Tolkien's world when you look past the surface, refuse to be filed away. They linger. They haunt. They occupy the space between certainty and doubt, between light and shadow, between heroism and betrayal, and they will not be moved. Perhaps that is the point. The West loves its heroes. It builds monuments to them. Aragorn, king restored, the line of Elendil unbroken at last. Gandalf, the wise pilgrim who guided the quest and stood against the Balrog. Frodo, the small and humble ring-bearer who saved the world through mercy and endurance. Even Samwise, the loyal gardener who carried his master when all strength failed. We know these are heroes because the story tells us so, again and again, in word and deed and song. Their choices are validated by victory. Their sacrifices are redeemed by the new age they usher in. But the blue wizards have no such story. They have only fragments, whispers, guesses, contradictory accounts written by a scholar who changed his mind about them repeatedly over decades. And perhaps that is not a failure of storytelling, but a reflection of a deeper truth, that not all heroism is visible, and not all betrayal is obvious, that the most important struggles often leave no monuments, that some who save the world do so in ways the world will never recognize or understand. Consider the nature of their mission. They were sent to the East, not to conquer it, not to convert it by force or spectacle, but to undermine Sauron's influence from within, to work in secret, to achieve results that would never be attributed to them, to labor for centuries with no expectation of recognition, no hope of gratitude, no promise of reward. If they succeeded, no one would know. If they failed, no one would mourn. It was a mission designed for obscurity, for selflessness, for the kind of sacrifice that receives no earthly reward. That must be its own justification. And if that is true, then the very fact that we know so little of them may be the greatest proof of their success. Think about it carefully. If the blue wizards had failed catastrophically, if they had become dark lords, ruling vast empires, if they had allied with Sauron and raised armies to march on the west, if they had betrayed their mission and become a threat to everything the free peoples held dear, would we not have heard of them? Would Gandalf not have spoken of them with sorrow and warning, as he did of Saruman? Would the histories of Gondor not record their names alongside Saruman's as fallen Istari? Cautionary tales of pride and corruption inscribed in every chronicle. Would the elves not remember them in sorrowful songs? But they do not. The blue wizards are barely mentioned. They are footnotes, mysteries, question marks in the margins of history. And perhaps that is because they did exactly what they were meant to do. They stayed in the shadows. They did not seek glory. They did not become legends. They did not need to be remembered. They simply worked, quietly, invisibly, for centuries, And when their work was done, or when they could do no more, they vanished without asking for recognition. There is a humility in that, a purity. It is the opposite of Saruman, who craved recognition, who needed the world to see his greatness, who could not bear the thought of being second to anyone. It is even the opposite of Gandalf, who, for all his wisdom and sacrifice, was known, was loved, was celebrated, was given titles and honors. The Grey Pilgrim, the White Rider, the enemy of Sauron. The Blue Wizards asked for none of that. They asked only to be forgotten. And in a world obsessed with legacy, with monuments, with the preservation of names and deeds, perhaps that is the greatest heroism of all. But there is always a but, because humility can also be a mask. Obscurity can hide sins as easily as virtues, and absence, in the end, proves nothing. What if the Blue Wizards did fall? What if the East broke them? Not through grand temptation as it broke Saruman, not through dramatic corruption, but through slow, grinding despair. What if they looked at the peoples they were meant to save and realized the task was impossible? That no amount of teaching, no amount of hope could undo millennia of corruption, generations of lies so deeply embedded that they had become truth. What if they gave up? What if they simply walked away, abandoning their mission, disappearing into obscurity, not because their work was done, but because they could no longer bear the weight of it? Or worse, what if they adapted too well? What if, in order to survive in the East, in order to be heard and taken seriously, they became so much like the warlords and priests they opposed that there was no longer any meaningful difference? What if they told themselves it was for the mission that the ends justified the means, that they could always return to the light once the war was won? And then the war was never won, and they never returned, and they became the very darkness they swore to fight. Tolkien understood this possibility. He wrote, in one of his letters, that the Astari were vulnerable precisely because they were clothed in mortal flesh. They could tire, they could doubt, they could fail. They could be corrupted not necessarily by evil, but simply by despair, by exhaustion, by the slow erosion of purpose that comes from struggling too long against impossible odds. Saruman failed in this way, not because he was inherently evil, but because his pride and his despair made him vulnerable to Sauron's manipulation. Radagast, in his own way, failed too, not through corruption, but through distraction, through becoming so absorbed in his love of nature that he forgot the larger mission. Is it so impossible to believe that Alatar and Pallando failed as well? That they too were mortal enough to break under the weight of their task? Perhaps one did and one did not. Perhaps they became enemies, fighting a hidden war in the deserts of the East for centuries. Each convinced the other had betrayed the mission, each certain of their own righteousness. Perhaps that is why they never returned, because they destroyed each other, and their bones lie buried beneath the sands, unmarked and unmourned. Or perhaps they both fell, but in different ways. Perhaps one became a tyrant, a dark lord ruling through fear and sorcery, and the other became a broken wanderer, searching hopelessly for redemption that would never come, unable to return to the West because of the shame of what they had become or allowed to happen. We do not know. And that, more than anything, is what makes the Blue Wizard so haunting, so enduring, so powerful as a mystery. Because in the end, The question is not really about them. It is about us. It is about what we do when we cannot see the outcome of our actions. What we do when there is no one watching, no one to judge, no reward waiting at the end, no guarantee of success. Do we persevere? Do we compromise? Do we adapt? Do we break? And at what point does adaptation become corruption? At what point does endurance become stubbornness? At what point does pragmatism become betrayal? The blue wizards are a mirror, and what we see in them says more about ourselves than it does about two figures who may or may not have existed, who may or may not have succeeded, who may or may not have even been real in the sense that the other wizards were real. Tolkien never finished their story. Perhaps he could not. Perhaps he realized, as the years passed and he rewrote their fate again and again, that some tales resist endings, that some mysteries are more powerful unsolved, that some questions do more good by remaining open than they ever could by being answered. The blue wizards are Middle, Earth's great unknown, and in a legendarium so thoroughly detailed, so exhaustively chronicled, so meticulously constructed that absence is a kind of presence. It is a gap that shapes everything around it, a silence that speaks. They are the gap in the record, the silence between the notes, the story that was not sung, the heroes or villains who never got their moment in the light. And maybe, just maybe, that is exactly where they belong. Because in every age, Middle Earth remembers its heroes. The statues are carved in enduring stone. The songs are sung in every hall. The books are written and copied and preserved. But what of those who saved the world in silence? What of those who sacrificed everything and asked for nothing? What of those who walked into darkness so complete that even their victories would be mistaken for defeats? That even their triumphs would be invisible to history? Perhaps they are forgotten by design. Perhaps they understood that true service requires no recognition. Perhaps they knew that the moment you seek glory, you have already failed in some essential way. Or perhaps they are remembered only in the quiet moments, when the wise pause and wonder, when the firelight flickers and casts strange shadows, when the wind whispers from the east bearing strange scents and stranger stories. Perhaps they are remembered not in songs, but in silences, not in monuments, but in mysteries. Perhaps they are not meant to be categorized as heroes or traitors at all. Perhaps they are meant to be something more difficult, more painful, more true, a reminder that the most important work is often the least visible, that the deepest sacrifices go unrecorded, that there are those who give everything and receive nothing, who labor in darkness so that others may live in light, who accept obscurity as the price of their service. And if that is the legacy of the blue wizards, if their only monument is the absence of atrocities that might have been, the survival of peoples who might have perished, the whisper of hope in lands where hope was forbidden, then perhaps they are the greatest heroes of all. Or perhaps they are the greatest warning. A reminder that even the chosen of the Valar can be lost, that even the noblest missions can end in ruin, that even the wisest can fall, that the road to hell is paved not just with good intentions, but with exhaustion, isolation, and the slow erosion of purpose. We do not know, we will never know, and perhaps in the end, that is the only honest answer. The blue wizards are Shah Dinga's heroes, both triumphant and fallen, both saviors and traitors, both remembered and forgotten, existing in a state of narrative superposition until the box is opened and the truth revealed. But the box will never be opened. Tolkien made sure of that when he chose not to write their story definitively, when he left them in the margins, when he gave us contradictory accounts and then walked away, leaving us to wonder forever. And so we are left with the image that began this tale: two robed figures walking into the sunrise, their shadows stretching long behind them, their destination unknown, their fates unwritten, their names whispered by those who do not fully understand what they mean. They walk still in the lands beyond the maps, in the stories that were never told, in the silence between the ages, in the questions we ask when we wonder what heroism really means, when we doubt our own choices, when we struggle in obscurity and wonder if it matters. And if you listen, truly listen, in the quiet moments, you can almost hear them, not speaking, not calling, not claiming recognition or demanding justice, just walking, step by step by step, into the endless, beautiful, terrible East, forever. Dear listener, this story ends, but many await. Subscribe so no tale escapes you.